a blessing to a world in desperate need of hope. 5 years ago this month, on March 27, 2020, Pope Francis stood on the rainy steps of St. Peter's Basilica and delivered an Urbi et Orbi blessing to people across the globe, asking God to bring healing and peace to those suffering from the spread of COVID-19. An empty and lifeless St. Peter's Square highlighted the fear and isolation brought on by the pandemic, but the Holy Father's message of hope and courage touched the hearts of millions. Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. I'm Rosal Regis, in this week for Catherine Hadro. 5 years ago, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, leading to a devastating period of isolation, sickness, and fear for the entire world. It changed the way we communicate, the way we work, and the way we worship. And its lingering effects can still be seen in the U.S. Church today.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
5 years ago, the World Health Organization declared an international health crisis, setting in motion a months-long lockdown. Businesses shuttered, millions of jobs were lost, and large gatherings became off-limits. Unable to go to school or work, Americans were isolated in their homes. Many feared for their lives as they watched the death toll climb. According to the data from the CDC, more than 1.2 million Americans have lost their lives to the virus since 2020. Deaths reached an all-time high at the beginning of 2021, with more than 25,000 deaths during the week of January 9th. All this with many Catholics unable to turn to their church for the sacraments, the core of the Catholic faith and a vital source of God's grace.
So we know this is very tough. It's tough for us, and it's certainly tough for the people. We really miss each other and being able to be together.
COVID-19 left priests in a delicate balance of providing for their flocks while also following local restrictions. Many masses moved online. Some communities held services outdoors. Others offered communion to parishioners right in their cars. In Lansing, Michigan, one priest took Eucharistic adoration to the skies, processing with the Blessed Sacrament 10,000 feet above his diocese in an airplane. Some of those most affected by the pandemic were Catholics in the hospital, suffering alone, often without physical contact with their loved ones. Cardinal Sean O'Malley, then the head of Archdiocese of Boston, created a task force of priests to quarantine and administer sacraments to those patients. Father Ryan Connors, one of the members of that task force, says serving the sick during the pandemic was a profound experience.
It was a manifestation of the Church's closeness to people to ensure that even in this difficult time of the pandemic, the preaching of the gospel and the administration of the sacraments, so far as possible, was able to continue.
COVID-19 also had a devastating impact on school children, whose math and reading scores plummeted. The Church recognized the need for students to safely attend school in person. The National Catholic Educational Association found more than 90% of Catholic schools opened safely 5 days a week with hybrid options during the 2020 to 2021 school year, compared to just 56% of public schools.
Personally, it was so fun. I'm so happy my parents chose to send me back because, I couldn't imagine doing this online school another year.
Catholics also fought to keep their churches open, though many states began to allow indoor services with social distancing and capacity limits. Some created outright bans, even as secular businesses and gatherings were allowed to reopen. Catholics in California, Minnesota, New York, Washington, D.C., and Wisconsin filed lawsuits against these restrictions, and courts overwhelmingly sided with the churches.
The court started to say to the government, hey, what's your reason or what's your proof for thinking church is more dangerous than a casino or some other activity? Turns out the governments didn't have proofs.
Now, more than a dozen states legally protect religious gatherings as essential. But even as churches reopened their doors during the pandemic, some typical Mass goers were still hesitant to return to Mass. Georgetown University's Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, or CARA, tracks weekly Mass attendance. Before the pandemic, about a quarter of self-identified Catholics attended weekly Mass. That number dropped to 15% for most of the pandemic. Dr. Mark Gray, Senior Research Associate at CARA, says Mass attendance returned to pre-pandemic levels in 2023. Though Sunday Mass is an obligation in the Catholic faith, Gray says many Catholics still tune into online Mass.
The unusual thing is that even though in-person attendance is back to normal, that search volume for Catholic Mass on YouTube remains elevated.
But he says the data shows Catholic resilience.
People found ways to continue to practice their faith, and in some ways became even more prayerful and relied on their faith to get through some of the harder times of the pandemic.
To further discuss the church and COVID-19, we are joined by Dan Cellucci, CEO of the Catholic Leadership Institute. His organization has been at the forefront of analyzing COVID's impact on the faithful. Dan, it's been 5 years since the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world. Looking back, how did the church accompany the faithful during that difficult and isolating period?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I think we can look back at that time and see a lot of things we'd like to do maybe differently, but I think there's a lot of things to celebrate too. The church pivoted pretty quickly to start streaming Mass, to get communication out, to adapt to new technologies, not only streaming, but things like digital communications, like I'm reaching with you right now. And so I think for an organization that's not known to move quickly, I think we pivoted pretty quickly, and I think we're able to provide relationship and connection to our people in a relatively short time.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on this already. How has COVID-19 changed the Catholic Church?
Yes, well, in some ways, dramatically, we lost a lot of folks quickly. We've been able to gain, I think, most of them back by most of the research that we've seen and that we've done. However, we still have some folks who have not returned, I think, from those who were attending before. And I think it also I think COVID also showed us or highlighted some of the instability in some of our parish communities that was probably there already, but became a lot more clear during the pandemic. And so some of those parishioners who were maybe coming but not as actively engaged, I think you saw that fall away in that time. On the plus side, though, again, things like technology, ways to communicate, I think a lot of diocesan and parish kind of functions have gotten a little bit more efficient. We can meet different ways. We can figure out different ways to communicate, a lot more comfort with email communication, text communication, some really important means of reaching our people. I think COVID actually catalyzed that for the church and allowed us to kind of get a little bit closer up to speed on some of those important ways that people are communicating.
Right, different circumstances. And many parishes still provide live streams of their masses, like what you mentioned. It's a grace for homebound and ill parishioners, but those healthy and able are obligated to attend in person. So how can churches provide this ministry for the homebound while also encouraging other parishioners to begin attending in person again?
You're right. There's some really good reasons why we should continue to live stream, in addition to the ones that you mentioned. It's been a nice way for people who might be mourning a loved one from afar to be able to at least watch the funeral Mass or a wedding via live stream. So there's some, again, continued benefits to live streaming. But I think, as you mentioned, we do have an obligation to attend every week. And so I think what we have to do is be careful that in those technologies that we're using and being present in a digital way, that we're always inviting people back into the incarnational experience that we believe is so important. And so those forms of invitation can take many forms, but I think a parish has to be really leading with that invitation to come, to be a part of the real presence that we believe is present during the Mass. And so whether that's actually speaking to those who are live streaming and acknowledging their presence, and with gratitude that they are tuning in, but also inviting them to come and check out the beauty of the real presence in the Mass. I think simple ways like that we see are helping to bridge that divide.
Right. And Dan, Pope Francis marked the 12th anniversary of his pontificate this week. Many remember the powerful moment when he said the Urbi et Orbi blessing in an empty St. Peter's Square 5 years ago, which we showed at the top of our program. How did the Holy Father guide the Church during the pandemic?
Well, I think, the Holy Father, from the beginning of his pontificate and certainly now, has always been about telling us who God is. And God is love, God is truth, God is mercy, and how important it is that we be in relationship with each other, in relationship with God. And so I think that moment that you highlighted, that one speaks to my heart still 5 years later. It brought me to tears then. It brought me to tears watching it in this segment. But I think that witness of who we are together in Christ is what the Holy Father really just has always highlighted, and what I've really appreciated about his leadership.
Yes, and right now there's a lot of things going on in our nation. What do you think people here in the U.S. should do to better our church as a whole?
Yeah, well, I think, among all the trends that we're tracking, and a lot of them are not necessarily the most encouraging, but there are a few real glimmers of hope that I would just point out, and I think provide us with an opportunity here in the United States. For one, while it's not great, we have returned basically to pre-pandemic levels of mass attendance from 2020. And so again, that's still only about a quarter of us. We have a lot of room to grow there. However, you also notice that there's a flattening of those who are non-affiliated to any religion. So in other words, that hasn't grown much since COVID. And I think that's people really feeling a yearning to be in that real relationship. And they might not know that they want to be Catholic yet, but we have the opportunity to invite them into this wonderful life in Christ. And then the last thing that I would say is we have to keep in mind that we now live in a country and a culture that has two generations that may have never actually had an experience of faith. So we have to keep in mind that people might not be rejecting it. They may have actually never experienced it. And that can make us feel sad at times. But again, I think it's a great opportunity to propose the gospel for the first time, to invite people into this wonderful life and not make assumptions about why they're not coming or why they've stopped coming. A lot of times in our research, we see people have just kind of slowly drifted. So that they're not angry, they're not necessarily rejecting it. They just maybe need a little bit of a pullback. And I think that's all of our opportunity to do. And we have plenty of opportunities to do it in the United States of America.
Exactly. Well, Dan, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.